This woman recently started following me on Instagram. Apparently her friends call her Lily I, and based on her followers, she could have 154 friends. I'm not following her, so I guess I have to call her Alina7328. The link in her bio says Earth Church, which means she could be a religious type, or maybe a greenie, or just spiritual in the broad sense, or who knows. Maybe she likes trance music and her favourite track is God is a DJ by Faithless. To be honest, I'm too scared to click the link to find out. In any case, let's assume she's a real person and not spam. Now, when I look at profiles like this, full of selfies documenting different parts of someone's lives, or the ones they want people to see, I often wonder which selfie is closest to really showing that person's true self. Is it the most casual photo, or could it actually be one of the more self-consciously staged ones, or all of them together? This lecture pod isn't about Alina7328. Sadly, she seems like a fascinating and complex person. Looking at Alina7328's Instagram profile just now made me think about who we are as people, or to put it in theoretical terms, Alina7328 made me think about ideas of the self. That's what this lecture pod is about, the theoretical concept of the self. It's who we are as unique individuals. It's something that is produced and developed. It's dynamic. The process of creating a self is twofold, involving subjectivation and individuation. And the techniques and practices we used are called technologies of the self. Why is all this important? Well, we need to understand some basic ideas about the self and how it's developed in order to be critical of the role of media today, which is something I'll cover in another lecture pod. Let's look at a couple of examples that will help explain how we create a self. If I asked you, who are you? How would you describe yourself as a unique individual today, right now? One of the things that's likely that you'd say, I think, is I'm a student. And the reason you'd say this is that we quite often define ourselves by what we do most of the time. Now, here's a picture of some students from the UWS website. It's a great photo because it says so much, yet you wouldn't really think so. My first thought is this. It's a stock image. It just has that staged look about it, doesn't it? But if it is, that's fine. I mean, it's still telling of what a majority of people think a student is, because that's how stock images work. Just like Google search results, some stock image websites base their recommendation on what has worked for others, on what's been popular previously. So, according to this image, students are pretty happy, neat and tidy. They like hanging out before or after class, meaning they're on time and organised, and they look like they're chatting respectfully to one another. Also, there appears to be some cultural diversity in your average university. All in all, university life seems happy, fun and sunny. Now, I'm not saying this isn't what university life is like. I'm just saying this is what this representation says university life is like, and what university students are like generally. That said, how would you define yourself? Similar to the way this image defines you? Here's another representation of university students, one published by the Daily Telegraph. It appeared when I Googled University Student Sydney. This is another example of what society says students are. So how about this one? Could you say the ideas in this image play a role defining yourself? When you think of yourself as a student, do you naturally or consciously draw on the ideas and cliches embedded in this image of protest, of standing up against the man? Do you like how these ideas define you? Do they empower you, legitimize you? Or perhaps you react against them. Perhaps you use these ideas as a kind of foil to define yourself against, making you more like these two very preppy gentlemen. Let's think about these images of university students in a little more detail, using some concepts from Michel Foucault and a more contemporary theorist, Janelle Langlois. So here's another image of a student. This time I Googled typical Australian university student, and this is the image from a report in the newspaper The Australian. Insofar as images like these reflect some cultural ideas about university students, that likely have some level of influence on university students like yourself, we can say they are examples of how society defines subject formations. A subject formation is a kind of ideological mould presented to somebody that attempts to determine them in a particular way as subjects. The ideas I've shown you of what a student is, happy, organised, free, rebellious, white, are subject formations. It's out of these subject formations that we construct a self. We negotiate a position in relation to the subject formation. And this process is called individuation. So perhaps we accept these subject formations, or perhaps we don't. It's useful at this point of the lecture pod to discuss in detail a key concept I mentioned earlier, technologies of the self. But first let me tell you about what I heard on the radio yesterday. Triple J, as you may or may not know, is celebrating 40 years of being on air. Each day, to mark the milestone, they play a song from their music archive. Yesterday, they chose Scar Tissue from the Red Hot Chili Peppers' 1999 album, Californication. Before they played the song, they ran an old interview with one of the band, Flea, and they asked him about the album Californication. He made the point that the album is about the influence of Hollywood on the rest of the world. Flea and the band are critical of this influence, and so the album is all about Hollywood and California and the Californication of the rest of the world, which they see as a huge problem. Sure, he was talking about 1999, but things haven't changed much. Now, the reason I mentioned Californication and the Red Hot Chili Peppers is because Flea is making a big point about the self, and more specifically about how people construct a self, and what happens when this all goes wrong. Basically, Flea is pointing out how movies and music are what Foucault calls technologies of the self. The concept technologies of the self refers to the practices undertaken to aid in the construction of a self. So you can see the word technology has nothing to do in principle with electronic technologies, although they can be involved. This will make more sense if we consider some more examples, which will also make clear how Flea is doing Foucault in a sense. Back in the days of antiquity, example technologies of the self were confessions with priests, letters, and self-examination. So you did these things, each of which is a certain technology or practice, and you worked out something about yourself. Simple. Novels are also technologies of the self, as are films and television. The practice of engaging with these things helps you make sense of yourself. The images of students I showed you earlier are also technologies of the self. And of course, digital networked media is a technology of the self, made up of smaller technologies, including social networks, blogging, microblogging, and streaming video platforms. In engaging with the technology of the self, then, we're using the technology to work out who we are in relation to social, cultural, and religious norms. Involved is a process of reflection or trying to find out and know ourselves. But also, Foucault makes clear that different technologies of the self allow us to construct ourselves in different ways. Now back to the Red Hot Chili Peppers. Flea realises Hollywood movies are a technology of the self, and he's worried that in engaging with this particular technology, people are getting all the wrong ideas. I suppose he's talking about the strength of certain subject positions, in other words, of certain ideas of how to behave and act, based on all the cliched Hollywood values such as materialism, greed, vanity, etc. For Flea, the subject positions of Hollywood are too strong, and as a result, people are taking on negative subject positions and failing to really negotiate a genuine position in relation to them. This is Californication. Sure, Flea's not doing Foucault, but he is referring to the same issues Foucault talks about. Flea raises an important problem, which is this. What kind of self do different technologies allow us to produce? What are the power struggles involved? And most importantly, is the end result empowering or limiting? have a think about the technology of the self you use and ask yourself, what kind of person is this allowing me to be? Each technology allows you to occupy yourself with yourself, but what kind of self do you end up with? To sum up, in this lecture pod, I've discussed who we are as individuals. In other words, I've discussed the concept of the self. I've also talked about how the idea we have of ourselves is produced in relation to what society says we are, through the subject positions present in culture and manifest in media. But I've also talked more specifically about media as technologies of the self. That is, about how we use different media to work out stuff about who we are, possibly just as Alina7328 is doing right now on Instagram. Thanks for listening.